As miniature painters, I think it's safe to assume that we've all been in this scenario. You've got a new mini that you're ready to paint. You've got an idea of what you want it to look like. You've done research on how it's supposed to look, how the creator wanted it to look. You've got your color palette ready. But here's the dilemma. What brand or type of paint am I going to use? Hopefully I'll be able to shed some light on that situation today. Hey guys, welcome to Dicejunkies Paint Lab. My name is Tim from Eldritch Studios, and today we're going to be discussing what type of paint to use for your miniature painting. Now, you want to go acrylics pretty much all the time. Enamel is more difficult to work with, doesn't really do the same for miniatures, and it's a lot harder to clean up if you make mistakes. Acrylic is just the way you go. It's kind of the industry standard. But what brand? You know, there's all sorts of things out there. Games Workshop, Vallejo, Reaper, P3, Secret Labs. There's a whole lot of different choices for you that are out there. So what I'm going to do today is do a little experiment to test the overall usefulness of each particular type of paint. Now, what I've done is I've chosen 4 of the more popular brands, specifically the Game Workshop brand Citadel, Vallejo's Game Color, Army Painter, and P3, which is Privateer Press. It's their main brand. I've also done a control with a craft paint. That's basically a 57-cent paint that you can get at Walmart, Hobby Lobby, Michael's, pretty much any place that you can go buy craft stuff. Not necessarily recommended for miniature painting, but it'll do in a pinch. And it gave me some very interesting results at the end. But before we get started, I do want to say that this is a very subjective matter. A lot of people have their own personal preferences, and because each type of paint, when you're using acrylics, each brand has its own recipe. And these recipes have different mediums that they use for it. It's all going to be the same for the most part. It's acrylic paint, but they're going to handle differently underneath the brush. So, above everything else, find a paint that works for you. And be sure, don't be afraid to play around and experiment, kind of like what I'm doing today. So, with that, let's go ahead and get into it. So here is the setup for the experiment. I've got my wet palette, I have my acrylic paper, and I have these 5 miniatures. These are just basic Primaris Marines from Game Workshop Warhammer 40k. First thing that we're going to start off with, though, is the acrylic paper. And I've labeled each one for the specific paints that we're going to be using. Now, through this, I'm going to be using the same brush. This brush is, it's an Army Painter Wargamer Regiment brush. Nothing really special about the brush, except for it is a decent brush, and it is going to be consistent. So for the first paint that we're going to be using, I'm going to go with Game Workshop's brand, the Citadel Paint. This is Evil Sunz Scarlet. As I mentioned, I'm going to be using red for all of this, because it is notoriously thin on pigments, and depending on the viscosity and the opacity, it will not cover the black very well. But you can see this is already a semi-thick paint to begin with. So I'm going to put a little bit on the wet palette here, and just let that kind of soak up the water a little bit. Second paint that I'm going to be using today is Vallejo's Game Color Bloody Red. Now these paints, they are different. Each brand is going to have a slight different pigmentation, but they should all be fairly similar. So with the dropper bottle, I'm going to just drop some directly onto the wet palette and let that sit. I'm going to be thinning down each of these to same consistency. Next we have Army Painter's Pure Red. Again with the dropper bottle. Put that right on the wet palette. Then we're going to go with Privateer Press's P3 Cador Red Base. This one also a pot. As you can see, I've used this one a lot, but it's still a good paint. Just like we did with the Citadel Paint, just brush it directly onto the wet palette. And last but not least, we're going to use the craft paint that I got. Now this is just crimson. It was the closest thing that I could find to the color. And I'm just going to dab a little bit of that onto the wet palette. So there are our 5 paints. Starting off with the Games Workshop red. And just thin down the paint just a little bit, get an even consistency, and just do even strokes directly onto the paper here. And as you can see, it goes over really well. You don't see too much fading out of this, and the consistency that I'm trying to get with this is just a little bit thicker than skim milk. We don't want to do a layer. This is more of a base coat that I want to do on here. But as you see, it's hard to tell any brush strokes. Now the camera kind of changes it a little bit, and I'm going to try and get a little bit of a different angle here for you. But you see a little bit, but not much. And it's also, even when wet, a very flat paint. Then we're going to move on to Vallejo's Bloody Red. This one I thinned down to about the same consistency. And we're just going to layer on our base coat here. Starting off, we're seeing about the same thing. It's got a good pigmentation, although you do see a little bit of kind of a brightening to the edges, and you can also see that this is already a glossier paint to begin with. And once that's painted, kind of give it a look. I'm trying to get as many brush strokes out of it as possible, but it goes over very, very evenly. Don't see quite as much brush strokes in this one, but it is a much glossier paint. Now we're thinning down the Army Painters. This is Pure Red. And you can see on the wet palette there, even at the same consistency, it's trying to pool up much more than the other paints did. Has to do with the surface tension of the medium that is used in the paint itself. And even with the same consistency, you can see from here that it's definitely got more surface tension. We can see the brush strokes in here. It's coming off as a much thinner paint, almost like a watercolor. Doesn't seem to have quite the pigmentation that Vallejo or Games Workshop's Citadel Paint does have. But it does seem to blend together rather well. So now we're going to move on to P3. With the P3, starting off, it looked very similar to Vallejo and Citadel. However, it does not like to stay in the brush's bristles. You can definitely see, even through the top, but definitely in the bottom of it, it shows off the paint, the brush strokes much more so than the others. Does not move around with the brush nearly as well as the other ones did. But it does seem to have a bit higher pigmentation than Army Painter. Now we're going to take a look at the control. This one, to get to the same viscosity, I did have to add a little bit more water. Craft paints are typically going to be thicker than your other paints. And after I finally got it to the same viscosity, we will paint it right onto the acrylic paper. This one's kind of a mess. As you can see, it does have a lot more of that watercolor look, similar to the Army Painter. You don't get nearly as many brush strokes. It feeds out of the bristles very, very well. There's not a lot of pooling. It's easy to kind of move it around. And we get a very even coat. But you can kind of see that white underneath it still. It almost gives it a pinkish hue. But again, I mean, it does have its good points. Not really any brush strokes. And it is a very matte paint compared to the other ones. Except for probably the Citadel. So now I'm going to go over each of the miniatures. So the first one here we have is Citadel, Evil Sunz Scarlet. As you can see, as I paint these, I am just throwing the paint on there. This is going to be just the simplest base coating that I can do. But you can see, even with this one, it has really, really good coverage with just one coat. And now for Vallejo's game color. This is Bloody Red. Similarly, it has pretty good coating, but I'm interested to see what's going to happen after it dries. You can still see some black coming through, and that's a little worrisome. Now I've got Army Painter's Pure Red, and you can see that black is just showing through, even though the viscosity is the same as the other ones. It doesn't move as well on here. I have a feeling it's going to take a few coats. Now for P3. The P3, similar to Vallejo, not quite as much as Games Workshop. It does have a good coat. I did have to get some more paint, but after putting that on there, it has a pretty good base coat for it. And it wasn't really hard to paint on there. Finally, the craft store paint. This one, to get it to the same viscosity, we had to thin it down so much that it almost looks pink. And as you can see, there's a lot of that black showing through. It's almost as if we're just layering it on there. So after they've dried, this is the Games Workshop Citadel Evil Sunz Scarlet. This is one coat. Pretty good. For Vallejo, game color, it is much darker, and you can see it is shinier, but it turned out pretty good. Can't really complain too much about this one. Probably needs a few more coats though to get that same coverage. For Army Painter, after it dried, this is a much darker red, and that black kind of shows through in spots. Definitely going to need another coat or two, maybe 3 coats in total. P3, kind of in between. It does have good coverage, although you can still see some brush strokes on this one. And again, I was just throwing the paint on. And then our pink marine. So yeah, this one's going to need a lot of work. Probably multiple coats. I don't really want to go thicker with it though. So we'll see what happens after I coat everything up. This is the Citadel model after 2 coats. Vallejo after 3 coats. Army Painter after 3 coats. P3 took 4 coats to get like this. And then 6 coats for the craft paint. So, final thoughts, guys. It really is going to depend on what you're using the paint for. As you can see, Citadel definitely has better opacity than everything else. Game color has a little bit more of that darkness and the glossiness to it. And the other 3 are just kind of unique in their own rights. Army Painter's good for a quality, cheaper paint. P3's definitely good as kind of a mix. Definitely used more for basing, and you got to be careful of the undercoating. And then the craft paint is the craft paint. So it's definitely going to depend on what you are using the paint for. For basing, I would definitely go with Games Workshop. But after that, layering, Game Color, Army Painter, it really just kind of depends. P3 also very good, very versatile. The craft store paint, I would probably stay away from that, but as you can see, it is definitely something that is usable. So I hope you enjoyed this video, learned a little bit. I definitely did. Be sure to like and subscribe, and let me know what you think. If there's anything else that you would like me to experiment on or test out, you know, that's what the Paint Lab is for. So until next time, guys, just remember, painted minis always roll better.